Welcome to All In, a straight-shooting, science-based podcast about periods, fertility, and nurturing health outside of unrealistic beauty expectations. We will mostly, but not exclusively, focus on hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA, a component of the female athlete triad, and relative energy deficiency in sport.
I'm Dr. Nicola Rinaldi, scientist and lead author of the book No Period, Now What? I specialize in helping people understand how their eating, exercise, and lifestyle habits are keeping them from hormonal health and their best life. My work focuses on regaining periods, improving fertility, and breaking free of the rules of underlying diet culture.
My name is Florence Gillet. I'm a certified eating psychology coach and the founder of BeyondBodyImage.com. I specialize in mental recovery, helping people let go of toxic health beliefs to finally feel at ease in their bodies at any size.
Every 2 weeks, the All In podcast brings you real recovery stories, expert insights, and new scientific research on HA, hormonal health, and fertility, with an unmissable touch of body respect and women's empowerment.
Just a reminder that this podcast represents the opinions of the hosts and their guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Music by the Andy Shulman Band, available on Spotify. Hello, Nicola. It's so nice to be here again.
It is 1:34 in the morning. It's a great time to be recording a podcast.
Which is much better for me. It's 9:34 in the morning. Yes. So I feel a lot fresher, most likely. Don't ask me to stay up until 1:30. You wouldn't be able to hear my voice, most likely.
I did actually take a nap today.
Oh, good. Naps are wonderful, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yep.
Good plan to have a nap. So, so today we wanted to talk a little bit about hypothalamic amenorrhea basics. And so today, Nicola, you are on the hot seat. I am going to interview you and ask you a few questions so that we can have a conversation about what to think about if some of you are listening to us and are really new to HA. And have no idea about what it is. So I think let's jump in if you're ready.
I'm ready.
So what does the name hypothalamic amenorrhea, which we usually call HA in short, refer to?
So it is a condition where you are missing your normal monthly menstrual cycles. The technical definition of amenorrhea is that you've missed your period for 3 months or more. So that's the amenorrhea part. Hypothalamic refers to the fact that the hypothalamus is a small organ in your brain that controls your reproductive system. And that is the organ that's sort of shutting down your menstrual cycles. So hypothalamic amenorrhea is amenorrhea derived from your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is this amazing control center in your brain. So it takes in inputs from all over your body, including things like it senses the reproductive hormones, levels of estrogen and progesterone. It senses levels of cortisol, stress hormones. It senses all sorts of things about food and eating in terms of, for example, there are mechanical receptors in your esophagus and your stomach that send signals to your hypothalamus, so it knows when you've eaten a certain volume of food. It has receptors for various hormones that are generated when you eat different macros. For example, fats, proteins generate different hormonal responses from your gut and your small intestine. Obviously, when you eat carbs, we all know that those get broken down to glucose, and your hypothalamus has glucose sensors. It has insulin sensors. Wow. It senses other hormones like leptin, which tells it about basically the amount of body fat that you have. So it's taking in inputs from basically all over your body, and then it sends out signals to control a lot of the other hormonal output from different organs. So it sends Thyrotropin releasing hormone goes to your pituitary, which then sends out TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that goes to your thyroid, which then sends out other, the hormones that the thyroid gland actually makes. It sends out gonadotropin releasing hormone, which also goes to your pituitary and causes that to release FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. So that's how it controls your reproductive system.
Right.
It sends out corticotropin releasing hormone that controls your adrenal glands. It sends out ADH, antidiuretic hormone, that controls your water balance. So it's this amazing organ that controls an incredible amount of what our body does. Oh, it also sends out ghrelin, which is a hunger inducing hormone.
Yes.
So it's this master control center, and we really don't know. We're not really taught that much about it. So I think I've learned more and more, I think it's just amazing everything that this teeny tiny little part of our bodies does. Um,
Totally.
and so what happens when you have HA is that the hypothalamus is suppressed because it's not sensing enough in terms of energy intake, or enough carbs, or enough fats, or it's being suppressed through
Yes.
cortisol.
So that's
So,
something I'm going to interrupt you for a
yes.
moment, because I found that that's something that a lot of my clients were not aware of, is that it's not just how much you eat, but it's also the types of food.
Mhm,
And so I find that there's under the radar dieting that can happen, like women that will say, oh, no, but I'm not actually reducing in terms of, counting my calories and making sure I only eat that in terms of number of calories.
mhm.
But I'm not allowing myself carbs. I'm never eating fats.
Right.
And that can disturb the order of things and how the hypothalamus actually receives the information and therefore also sends information
Yes,
out.
exactly.
So I think that's really something that's key, because
Mhm.
a lot of people are not aware that it's not just the quantities, and obviously your quantities will also have an important effect, right?
Yep.
But it's also that you can just reduce, basically take out completely a group of foods,
Mhm.
and it could have a detrimental effect on your hypothalamus as well.
Yeah. Which is why when you have people starting a keto diet, or starting intermittent fasting, or, going paleo, that there is often a loss of period that comes along with that.
True. And then you also mentioned, I remember you mentioned that something that was key for the hypothalamus was regular
Mhm.
eating, which again, like I find that if we talk about intermittent fasting and, just even going to sleep, right? We're gonna fast over the nighttime. This is something that is also important to take into consideration if you feel like your periods are all over the place or just completely gone, is to think, am I eating regularly, so that the hypothalamus kind of gets those
Yes.
messages that food is coming and energy is
Yeah,
coming.
absolutely.
Because
So there was a
yeah,
there was a study that was done in Sweden a few years ago, where they looked at a group of elite athletes. These women were all eating about 3,500 calories a day and burning about 1,000 calories in exercise. So a net of 2,500 calories, which, on the surface of it, you would think, "Oh my God, that's totally enough, right?" But some of them were missing their periods, and so the researchers looked and found that the women missing periods were actually in an energy deficit for 4 hours more per day than those who had their periods. So that's sort of where that comes from. So I have a blog post on this topic at noperiod.info/energy-balance, for anyone who wants to read more about the actual study and see some cool graphs that I put together. So,
yeah, I think this is fascinating because also it's only 4 hours, right?
mhm.
So, I mean, I've seen many ladies that tell me, well, I do intermittent fasting, but I allow myself over whatever the 6 hours or 8 hours I'm allowed to eat. And I'm eating so much, like I'm eating, way beyond the 2,500. But the reality is, if you're going to fast for the other 14 hours or 16 hours of the day, this is really what the problem is that
Yeah.
you don't send those messages regularly that it's safe, right?
Yep.
And so Yeah, I find that really interesting. And then I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the pituitary as well.
Mhm.
Sorry,
Yep.
my terrible accent.
No worries.
Difficult word for me to say. Um, so there is an important connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, right?
Yes. Yes. So the pituitary is what sends out the hormones that actually start the follicular growth process. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, that then goes to the ovaries and encourages the follicular growth process to start. So
Yeah,
that's really the hormone that's driving the menstrual cycle. It's funny because so many people think it's estradiol and progesterone. It's like, no, 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 those are downstream hormones. They get secreted by the cells that surround the growing follicle, but the
right,
actual driver is FSH. That's why in when you're doing fertility treatments, you use FSH and LH to encourage the follicles to grow. So that's
right.
yeah.
Makes sense. If we kind of make that simple, because I'm the
Mhm.
simple brain here. You're the scientist. I see this hypothalamus a bit like a supervisor, right? And
Mhm.
he's kind of delegating then to different glands and different organs what
Yeah.
is going to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of
So
like
he's kind of
the CEO of your body, and let's call it a her, please, not a he.
yeah, makes sense. Sorry for that. Oops. So she's really kind of taking in all the information, and some of the energy that comes in, it could be seen like, do we have enough stock? Right? Do
Mhm.
we have enough of this type of merchandise, for example, that we are able to then put out again? So I think this is really important for women to understand how all of that works.
Mhm.
Um, Now, so what are the kind of factors or components of HA? Now that we know that, why it's called HA, what are some of the components that actually can precipitate or create hypothalamic amenorrhea in someone with periods body?
Yes, yes. So I have a blog post on this topic as well at noperiod.info/HA, and it's also been translated into a number of different languages. So if anyone is interested, I think I have over 10 languages at this point. So definitely check that out. Those are at noperiod.info/translations, I believe. We can put that in the show notes. But I think it's nice for people to be able to read about this in their native language if possible.
Yeah,
So there are five basic factors in HA. I think the biggest one is energy deficit, and that is known to suppress your hypothalamus and so much else that your body needs to do because your body has a requirement for a certain amount of energy in a day. Like if you're just lying in bed all day, it's called your basal metabolic rate. And that's the energy that it needs in order to pump your blood, make you breathe, fuel your brain. Your cells are making protein and DNA. So all of that takes energy. We don't think of it as, in our society, we don't think of those basics as things that our body needs energy for, but that's one of the main things. That's survival, so that's a need to have. And then on top of that, we burn energy for our daily movement, for exercise, for digestion, all of that stuff. So if we're not taking in enough fuel for all of those things, then our body has to decide what to shut down. Because if it only has, like, let's say you need X calories and you're only getting half as many as you need, well, your body has to decide which things to fuel and which things not to fuel. So it obviously chooses to fuel pumping your heart, breathing,
thank God for
those
that.
the
We would
things that keep
drop
us
dead
alive.
after dieting.
Yes. Um, but then, there are so many other things that it can shut down. So one of the things that a lot of people notice is that they feel cold all the time when they have HA, and it's because that's an easy way for your body to save energy is not keeping you warm, not because
Not
that
turning
expends
the
energy. Yeah,
heating on, right?
exactly, exactly. Um, so energy deficit is the number one cause of HA for sure. Kind of tied into that is weight loss. HA is not about a particular body size. And I think that's really important for people to understand. You can lose your period for this reason, no matter what size your body is empirically. Um, and it's, but it tends to be associated with weight loss because weight loss typically comes from an energy deficit. So it's kind of a marker of the energy deficit in a way. But it
Yep.
also plays a separate role because of what I mentioned earlier with the hypothalamus sensing leptin levels, for example. So if you lose a significant amount of body weight, some of that will be body fat, some of it will be organ mass, some of it will be water. But the loss of body fat decreases the amount of leptin that your body fat produces, and therefore your hypothalamus senses that and is suppressed through not having, not getting enough leptin signaling. So weight loss is related to energy deficit, but it's also kind of its own thing, if that makes sense. Um,
Absolutely.
so that's
It
number
does
two.
totally make
Yeah.
sense.
And then exercise is the third factor. And
Mhm.
this, again, plays a role in two different ways. One is because when you're exercising, you're burning energy that your body then can't use for anything else because you're moving those muscles. It's that energy is getting used up no matter what your body actually wants or needs. And then also, high intensity exercise generates cortisol, and cortisol suppresses your hypothalamus. So, high intensity exercise in particular can help suppress your hypothalamus and either cause or prevent you from recovering from HA. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that part too. Um, so that's the exercise, how exercise is related to missing periods. Psychological stress also is a factor, again, through increased cortisol. So, particularly if somebody has sort of an acute stressful incident, death of a family member, you know, going through COVID and losing your job, all of that kind of thing is incredibly stressful. So it was actually really interesting at the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of women were coming to me and saying, "My period's late this month. What's going on?" And it's like, this is really stressful time. It's normal for our bodies to respond to stress by kind of shutting our periods down, and that's through the cortisol suppressing the hypothalamus. Um,
Totally.
and then the final factor is genetics. And this is something we have zero control over. But, there are so many proteins that are involved in sort of not only our reproductive systems, but sort of all of the other things that our hypothalamus does in terms of the actual hormones, the signal, the receptors for those hormones, the signals that are sent out. And if we have certain mutations, it may make it easier for us to lose a period, or conversely, everyone knows women who are, running marathons every other day and maintaining their period and, extremely small, whatever. But it's impossible. Like, comparison between one person and another is really not helpful at all for many reasons. But one of them is just that we all have different genetics. And so therefore, what works for one person is not necessarily going to work for the person sitting right next to them. Um,
Yeah, I think, one of the kind of mantra that I've had since this whole COVID pandemic also is like, let go of what you can't control.
mhm.
None of us can control our genetics. Yes, I totally get that it's frustrating that you might be larger than someone else who's, pregnant in an instant.
Mhm.
And even though she might run marathons or whatever, but the reality is there's not much we can do about that. So, and I think it's really important to also thank our bodies. I find that in the end, having a certain sensitivity to the energy deficit, to the weight loss, to the extra exercise, to the stress. I think it's sometimes also a way for our bodies to signal that, okay, you need to take care of
Yep.
myself, right?
Yeah. That's
Okay,
that's
so
that's one of the things that we talk about in the book No Period Now What, where all of this is in much greater detail.
yeah, get
Is
the book,
that it's
people.
yeah. um, it's easy to look at having a missing period, and especially when you want to get pregnant, and be really mad about it and upset and like, why me? Why am I having to go through this? But what I think we both ultimately find with the people that we work with is that when you recover, there's such a thankfulness for actually having gone through that, because you realize that you don't need to control every morsel that you put in your mouth. You do not need to exercise every damn day, come hell or high water. You can live your life, you can move your body, you can eat foods that you can enjoy, you can spend time with friends and family members and really enjoy your life instead of like living in this sort of food and exercise prison. And so I think that ultimately, even though when we're going through HA and trying to recover, we're often mad about it, in the end, it ends up being something that we end up being thankful for. So,
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. So if I sum it up, factors of HA will be energy deficit, number
mhm.
one, number two, weight loss. And it can be weight loss that happened a long while ago, right? It doesn't have to be immediate weight loss,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And then exercise, especially high intensity exercise, because it has the double whammy of using the energy available and raising our cortisol, which suppresses the hypothalamus even more. And then stress. Now, I want to be very clear because I've had a lot of clients coming to me also saying, oh, but I think it's just stress for
Mhm.
me. I know if I can work on the stress, I will bring back my period and I don't need to gain the weight. I don't need to eat
Mm.
more. I don't need to exercise less. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say we might lose a few people here, Nicola. I'm sorry to say this will not be enough. And why? I want to be also very clear. I mean, this is something I notice in my practice. Maybe you've noticed it too. Is that I find that this psychological stress is heightened in someone who is not eating enough, who
Mhm.
is exercising too much, and who lives in energy deficit,
Mhm.
because it kind of activates this cave brain, right? This kind of survival mode where we're constantly scanning the world for threats, where we're constantly scanning for potential ways to eat, right? Where we're constantly thinking about food and exercise as well, and it keeps us in that cycle.
Yeah.
So, and to come out of that, and this is the case both for eating disorders and disordered eating, you will not be able to just come out of it by working only on psychology. You will also need to eat enough and
Yes.
rest
Yes.
and really give your body a break.
Yeah,
Is it
I mean,
something?
I would completely agree with that, and I would also say that for most people, energy deficit is actually the biggest factor.
Yeah.
It's and it can be intentional or it can be unintentional, and I think that's sometimes where the difficulty in making that distinction comes in, because particularly if you're exercising a lot, it's easy to unintentionally not eat enough because your
Yes.
body, and I don't understand why this is, but your body does not necessarily send hunger signals after you've
True.
exercised. So
True.
if you're exercising a lot, you can think, oh, I'm not hungry, so therefore I'm
Hmm.
eating enough to support my exercise. So when you are somebody who is doing a fair bit of exercise, you do have to be more intentional about making sure that you're fueling enough to support that exercise as well as everything else that your body is doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so, something else about exercise. I mean, there's a bit of that knowledge, and I've heard this even said by doctors, that if you exercise a lot, or if you're an athlete or someone who does a lot of maybe, a lot of high intensity or a lot of endurance type of sports, that it would be normal, quote unquote, not to have a period. How do you feel about that?
It may be normal, but that doesn't mean it's right. I mean, there's a big difference between something that happens to everybody and your body actually being truly healthy.
Yeah, so it's
So I
not
think
healthy,
that's
right?
right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's common, but it's not healthy.
Yes, exactly.
For a lot of women that have followed really healthy, quote unquote, routines,
Mhm.
so where they kind of got into the habit of eating only a certain way or eating only certain foods or at certain times, and then they will exercise in a really rigid way as well, is to really understand that this is not healthy if you don't have a period,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And this, I think, would lead me to the next question. Is
Mhm.
it, do we really need periods?
So that is an interesting question. So we don't actually need to bleed, okay?
Yeah.
But the hormones that are associated with a normal menstrual cycle are incredibly important for our ongoing health. So there are about 20 different hormones that are involved in a normal menstrual cycle, which is why I think replacing those with something like birth control pills is not necessarily the best thing to do, because birth control pills or hormone replacement therapy give you two hormones, estradiol and progesterone, or some synthetic version thereof, as opposed to a normal menstrual cycle where you have constant changes in FSH, LH, inhibins, prostaglandins. I mean, there are so many different hormones that are involved. So a lot of what we know about the detrimental effects of having no period come from looking at women who are postmenopausal, because the two hormonal situations are quite similar in that you're not having the increase in estradiol that happens as your follicle grows and the egg inside matures. You don't get an increase in progesterone after ovulation. And those levels are much higher than what we're getting from any kind of hormonal supplementation. Um,
Mhm.
so, women post menopause tend to have a much higher risk of osteoporosis. There's a sharp
Yeah.
decrease in bone density that occurs once your menstrual cycles stop. And that's also seen in athletes with amenorrhea. That's very well documented. So that's
Yeah.
probably the number one concern for amenorrhea or younger menstruator with amenorrhea is bone density issues, and particularly if the amenorrhea started in the teenage years. That's when it's
When
particularly
they were growing.
concerning.
Yeah,
Mhm.
when they were still growing.
Yeah.
So concretely, I mean, bone density issues is in real life, it means that we have women breaking bones without even noticing,
Mhm.
right? Or just kind of missing a step off the sidewalk and then suddenly having a broken foot, and not being able to step on that foot for weeks.
Yeah. I think you describe it quite well in that osteoporosis, particularly when you're older, can lead to even to being wheelchair bound. And when we're in our younger years, we tend not to think too much about that, but it is important because the bones that you build in your teens, 20s, 30s, that's what you have to support you for the rest of your life. So I
Yeah.
think it's incredibly important to think about that and to not just brush off having no period, because it does have long-term consequences.
And especially if women are not looking to get pregnant immediately,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Some of the women we follow, they do not wish to become a mother immediately, but they still do the work of recovery because they know that on the long run it can have
Yes.
consequences.
Yep.
And bone density, I guess, is one of them,
Yep.
but there are other consequences, right?
Yeah, so the other big thing that is noticed in postmenopausal women is a sharp increase in cardiovascular disease. And it's really interesting because and I share some of this research in the book as well. There's actually an increase in um, risk of heart attack during, I think it's the luteal phase. I don't remember for sure, but it's when estradiol tends to be lower. There's actually a, a correlation with heart attacks during that phase of a menstrual cycle. So
Wow.
even just within a menstrual cycle, there are differences in your cardiovascular resilience. Yeah. Yeah. And so the issue is that when estradiol is low, the arteries are actually less elastic. So they're basically more brittle, and that can lead to issues with heart problems. I'm not a cardiologist, clearly, so this is. But there are studies that are being done in younger women. Dr. Schufelt out in the at Cedar Sinai in California has recently been running a study where she's looking at people in their 20s and 30s and looking at changes in heart parameters when they have amenorrhea versus not. So there's definitely ongoing research in this area.
Yeah. So do you know if that's related to this symptom that women can have if they are really kind of underfed, where, your heart rate is typically low? on the low end, I would say. And then, sometimes you go to the doctor and the doctor will see a low heart rate and say, "Oh my God, that's great. You're an athlete, right?"
Yeah.
Because athletes also share that trait, that they will have a really kind of low heart rate. But the difference is that when you test someone who's underfed, then, when you make them stand up and walk across the room, then suddenly their heart rate will shoot up, right? And that's not going to happen to an athlete, where it's going to stay pretty much steady. Is that related also, or maybe I'm completely wrong?
So
Oh, you
I
don't
know,
know?
yeah, I don't know. I don't know about the relationship between those two factors. I know Dr. Jennifer Gaudiani has talked about that, and I went to a conference where she spoke about that, and I was like mind blown, totally blown on that.
Yes.
Because it's like, yeah, low resting heart rate is super healthy, right? But not if you're, not if it's low because you've been so significantly underfueled. So it's actually really interesting to track your heart rate through recovery, because I've worked with a few people who have noticed that even within just a few weeks of eating more, their resting heart rate goes up quite a bit. And so it's an
Oh, that's
interesting
cool.
marker of of your body actually having more energy to use to pump the blood around your body. I mean, that's a pretty significant energy deficit if your body is slowing your heart rate that much because it doesn't have
Totally.
enough fuel to
And I find it interesting that, for me, for example, I remember always being asked, like, "Are you an athlete?" And I was like,
Mhm.
"No."
Mhm.
Why? And and the reality is, I had no idea. This is like 10 years ago, right? I had no idea this could be a sign of it, but it's more a sign of a really slow metabolism than
Yeah.
actually anything else. So, what are other kind of bad consequences of HA?
So the other one that is true for postmenopausal women is an increased risk of dementia or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, sort of neurodegenerative disease. So that's another one. We have no evidence of that in younger people, but it is something that is observed postmenopausally. So it is another potential concern. So those are sort of the
But a really
long term issues.
long term,
Yeah,
yeah.
but then short term, I mean, there are a lot of negative consequences of being in an energy deficit. We mentioned being cold all the time, having no
Yep.
libido, no vaginal lubrication, brittle hair and nails, poor digestion, poor skin. They're worse performance if you're an athlete,
Yeah.
all sorts of things. And they all kind of come under the umbrella of what's called relative energy deficiency in sport.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a bigger term for that sort of encompasses all of those symptoms that are related to an energy imbalance in somebody who's I mean an athlete, quote unquote, because all of us can be athletes. It doesn't have to be a professional athlete. If you're going
Yeah.
out and walking every day, you're an athlete of some description. I mean, I think that there's sort of this idea that you can only have HA if you're sort of an Olympic level athlete and training for hours every day, and that is absolutely not true. Um,
And I think that will lead us also to, again, repeating, and so, something you mentioned before when you were talking about weight loss. It's that you can have HA at any BMI,
mhm.
pretty much, right? So I think that's another thing, is kind of BMI is sometimes used, well, too often, I would say, used as a way to judge whether someone could have lost their period because they're underfed.
Yeah,
But the reality is, because what we're talking about here is an energy deficit, you could be an energy deficit. And if in reality being at a higher weight, this is something that is really, really detrimental to people coming to their doctor's office and being told that it cannot possibly be HA because they are not at a too low BMI,
yeah, yes.
or that the doctor doesn't even ask what their lifestyle habits would be.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very important to know that body size is not part of the diagnostic criteria for HA or for PCOS. It's which is
yep.
often
True.
misdiagnosed as, sorry, HA is often misdiagnosed as PCOS. And in neither case is body size part of the diagnostic criteria. So it shouldn't be ever that your doctor says to you, oh, you look normal, so that can't be your problem. Looks are not part of the diagnostic criteria.
No, that's so important, and it still happens so much,
Hmm.
right? That
It
we
does.
get the
Yep.
that we get the kind of, yeah, maybe you're on the, even if you are on the lower side of BMI, they will tell you, well, I guess you could be a little bit higher, but don't change anything.
Yeah.
This is good.
Yes.
You look
Yeah. Your
healthy.
eating's fine. Your
Uh,
exercise is fine. Just
and
wait.
to me,
Wait
the
and see if you get your
yeah,
period
yeah,
back.
just wait. Yeah. Uh, the you look healthy to me is really problematic, because now we've just
Yes.
associated that looking like you have visible abs is looking healthy. But the reality is, most of the women that have visible abs are actually at risk of having things like HA, because that means you probably don't have enough body fat, right,
Yeah.
to regulate some of your hormones. Now, let me jump to another question. So, if there are all these kind of negative consequences of HA, so I don't have a period, um, but I'm put on birth control,
Hmm.
would that kind of cover my bases in terms of helping with bone density, with heart issues, with possibly, later on dementia?
So we don't have enough research to answer the latter two questions, as far as I know.
All
The
right.
only the only one that's been looked at is bone density, and as far as that goes, being on birth control pills or hormone replacement therapy is better than having continual amenorrhea. That's not a
Right.
question. However, it is much better to have natural menstrual cycles. So, there's a spectrum. With amenorrhea, the bone density loss is something like -2 to 2.5% per year. On birth control pills, you're probably going to stay about the same. Um, with hormone replacement therapy, it's a little bit better than birth control pills because of the way that birth control pills are metabolized differently. They're metabolized through your liver, which reduces
Oh,
levels of a particular hormone, IGF-1, that's also involved in bone density. So there's been some interesting
okay.
research that's come out on that in the last few years. So hormone replacement therapy, where you wear a patch, an estradiol patch, is a little bit better than birth control pills, although it does not provide the contraceptive certainty
Of
that birth
course.
control pills do. So people should be careful of that. Like, hormone replacement therapy cannot be used for contraceptive purposes. Um, Although it does often suppress reproductive hormones and prevent cycles, but it's just not as clear cut as the birth control pills. But far better is having natural menstrual cycles, and
Mhm.
that is the level where you see normal increases, expected increases in bone density through the teenage years, 20s, 30s, and honestly, women that recover from HA often have a nice increase in bone density. And I have a theory as to why that is. Sort of similar to what happens post pregnancy and breastfeeding. So we know
Yeah.
that during pregnancy, the baby gets most of the calcium from the calcium that the mother is consuming. Breastfeeding is where it's much more of a challenge for bone density, because the baby is basically tripling in size in the first year, from 7-ish pounds to 20-ish pounds, something like that. So then is when you see a decrease in maternal bone density. But once
Yeah.
breastfeeding stops, the bone density sort of rebounds back to what it was prior to the breastfeeding. So I think that what happens after HA recovery is something similar, that because your body's now getting this rush of hormones that it hasn't had for a while, the bone density building goes into overdrive, and so you can build back some of what you might have lost over the years where you did have amenorrhea. Not to say that that means you can, be amenorrheic for 20 years and expect to have the same bone density as if you regained your period much earlier. So I don't want people to use that as an excuse.
No,
But I
of
think
course.
it's a little bit more hopeful than what people are often led to believe. So
Yeah.
I think there's so much hope around having HA and recovery, because it really is a condition that is it is reversible, And it is, we
Oh,
are
really?
able to, yes, yes, our bodies are not broken. They're simply shut down, and it's actually doing exactly what they need to do to protect us and to keep us as safe as possible. So it's actually that our bodies are working when we have amenorrhea, because they are making sure that we're conserving energy and using it in the way that's best for our body. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think this goes back to what we were saying about being more appreciative of that
Hmm.
body.
Yes.
If you have gone through HA and if you have had to do the work of
Hmm.
recovery, I find that, for many of us, and I mean, for me at that time, it was really about conceiving a baby. But by the time I was recovered and actually conceived really quickly, I felt like so appreciative. I was like,
Hmm.
this body that I basically underfed and overused, right? It still let me not only recover, but also conceive a baby
Yep.
and, having a great pregnancy, feeling great. Like it's just breastfeeding. It felt like this kind of miracle,
Hmm.
right? That it was just, I didn't have anything to do with. It was just really kind of feeding myself properly and
Yeah.
letting myself rest,
Yep.
um, which I think is really cool. So, and knowing that it is reversible, but also knowing that, is it the case for most women kind of being able to reverse HA? I would love to hear like what the kind of success rate is of applying all in as a method to recover for HA.
Yeah. So this was one of the questions that I asked in the survey that I did for No Period Now What. So for those who haven't listened to the earlier versions of this podcast, one of the things that it was included is a survey of over 300 women who had experienced HA and recovered. And well, not necessarily recovered, because many of them during the time of the survey were pregnant or breastfeeding or
Yeah.
whatever. So it wasn't necessarily possible to assess full recovery. But among those who had the opportunity to have normal menstrual cycles, the recovery rate was about 98%. And I lost touch with a
Amazing.
few of the people who were in that missing 2%. So it could be a little bit higher. I don't know. But in general, recovery is possible for just about everybody, and there, not everybody gets their period back in 2 months or 3 months. Some people have to wait a little bit longer. Some people have to do more work. There are other things that we can do to kind of push your reproductive system to get started again once you've sort of normalized your eating and exercise habits. So there's a chapter in the book called Still No Period, that where we go into
Yeah.
those kinds of things. Um,
I think that's what you also work on in coaching, right?
mhm,
Is really supporting those women that
mhm.
say, I've put in all the
Yep.
steps, and now I feel like, I need a bit of a boost. What else could I try? And I think this is where your expertise really comes in full force, way beyond the book, is kind of looking at also what's the latest research is, what else you could try, things that I remember, we thought we could try maybe 10 years
Mhm.
ago that now, like, are not doing much. And I think I'm so grateful for all your work. And I know I'm not the only one thinking that way. I'm so grateful for the work you put in, day out for the past decade, really kind of understanding more and more this issue and understanding how to come out of it, but also how to support fertility if it doesn't really kind of start,
Mhm.
kickstart in the way that we hope for. So,
Yep.
so that's really important. And one thing also I wanted to ask you about, you do mention that we need 3 recovery periods to be officially recovered, right? So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, so I wouldn't even call that officially recovered. The idea behind having 3 periods is that it's twofold. One is that your hormonal system can be quite sensitive still when you first recover. And so I think just giving it a chance to really settle into a normal kind of routine, a normal cycle, is important. Just so the way that the hormones in the menstrual cycle work is that they each follow on after the previous one. So it's kind of like a perpetual motion machine. And I just think it's good to, once you've started that machine, to let it kind of run through a few times to work out any of the kinks, kind of get things normalized again. So that's the first reason. The second one is I think it is incredibly important to track your ovulation. And I think this is for any menstruator at any point in their lives. I really would like that to be something that's really focused on more, probably in, sort of the late high school, college age, because before then you're kind of like, yeah, health class, whatever. But, maybe by the time you get to college, you can understand a little bit more about why it's so important. And it's because it's the best indicator of the health of our menstrual cycles.
Yeah.
Because you can have a monthly bleed without ovulating. Those are called anovulatory cycles. And if you're not tracking your ovulation, you don't know. And so, that's why I say 3 cycles, because I think that gives you a chance to learn your body's signs of ovulation.
Hmm. Hmm.
And not everybody ovulates on cycle day 14. That's kind of the thing that's in all the medical
Another myth.
textbooks. Yes, definitely a myth. So learning what's normal for your body is really important, because then as you go to, perhaps add back exercise or start to eat more intuitively, you can assess the effects of those changes on your cycle. Does your ovulation move to a week later than normal? Then I would
Yes.
say don't add any more exercise, maybe pull back a little bit. Is your luteal phase shorter? That's another sign. The luteal phase is the time between ovulation and when you get your period. So I think for any menstruator, it's really important to understand what ovulation is, how to track it, and to just pay it. You don't have to necessarily track by taking your temperature every single month, but learning what your body signs are, and that way you can kind of realize, oh, this month I don't feel like I've ovulated yet. Let me check my temperature. Let me see what's
Yeah.
going on. I mean, I'm 15 years recovered, and I still have times where I feel like my cycle is not quite right. And so, recently I've started taking my temperature again because I noticed my luteal phase was short, and so now I'm working on it. And the luteal phase is important because progesterone is high during the luteal phase, and
Hmm.
that is also important for bone density, as well as other things in our body. So having a short luteal phase can be problematic for pregnancy, because you can't get
Hmm.
pregnant if your luteal phase is less than about
Yeah.
9 to 10 days. Um,
Yeah.
but it's also just important in general for, again, our overall health and bone density and those kinds of things. Um,
Right.
so yeah, so that's why I say wait 3 cycles, because I think it's important to have those two things. And it doesn't mean that you're fully recovered. I mean, I don't know that any of us is ever 100% fully recovered. I mean, there's always little things that can trip you up. If
Of course.
if you have a big life stressor, for example, it can be very normal to sort of want to go back to you know using exercise as a coping mechanism, or controlling your food as a coping mechanism. So I think we always have to be a little bit careful of those kinds of things, and mindful when we have an issue, when we have another problem, and we do start to fall into some of those habits again, that we need to be careful and kind of pull back and maybe find somebody to talk to, or something. But
Yes.
just there's recovery is never yeah, I
There's
don't
no
feel like
one
it's
size fits
yeah,
all.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I don't feel like I don't feel like there's ever a like that you have recovered now. It's sort of, it's always kind of a moving target, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So,
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think if you have experienced HA in the past, there's this knowledge that you are obviously sensitive to that,
mhm.
and so I agree with you that sometimes you can kind of fall back into not just all the habits, but maybe not feeding yourself enough, maybe being really busy with something else, or having to take care of someone else, whether it's children or elderly in your family, or
Yeah,
and
or
so it might mean that
COVID.
you
I
don't
mean,
take care.
I've actually
COVID,
found this
obviously.
really challenging. I find I'm just not hungry anymore. I'm so tired of making food for myself and other people, and it's been
Feed
it's
yourself
been a bit of
first.
a struggle. It
Yeah,
has,
it's a
and
struggle. I keep reading that women are really mostly losing out of this whole situation, right? They're the ones dropping out of the
Mhm.
workforce, and having to kind of bear the brunt of this pandemic mostly. So it's really heartbreaking, and I feel like you. It's been definitely. I find that now it's kind of we found a little bit of a semi-normal,
Yeah.
but definitely between kind of March and June, it was such a big challenge
Mhm.
having to online, doing what I called crisis schooling, because
Yes.
I don't really like to call it home teaching. I'm like, no, I'm no teacher. Having to do that, running our businesses, having to take care of ourselves and our children, and not having any
Mhm.
help. Um, yeah, for
Yep.
sure, it can also play a role. So I wanted to finish on, okay, if some of the people listening to us are like, okay, I have the symptoms, I have the brittle hair and nails, I'm cold, I'm anxious,
I'm
I
peeing
feel
all
like I
the
could be
time.
taller, I'm moving all the time, I feel really guilty when I don't have my exercise routine or stuff like that. I might have lost weight in the past, and my period has disappeared. How do I get a proper diagnosis?
It can be a challenge, honestly. So there are many things that can cause missing periods. So it is
Hmm.
important to go to a medical professional, and have things ruled out. So thyroid problems can cause missing periods. High levels of prolactin can cause missing periods. There's a condition called Asherman syndrome where you have scarring in the uterus or vagina that can be cause a blockage that can prevent you from bleeding even if you are actually ovulating. um, I feel like there are a couple. Polycystic ovarian syndrome is another one that can cause missing periods. HA can cause missing periods. So it's important to have, to have all of those things ruled in or out, so that
Yep.
can be done through blood work. I have a blog post, or actually it's an Instagram post at noperiod.info/bloodwork that lists all of the different hormones that should be tested in order to sort of make determinations between these different factors. Um, uh, Premature menopause is another one that can cause missing periods in some people. Um, so and even in somebody that has primary amenorrhea, which is never having had a period, there can be
Yeah.
additional issues like genetic concerns that can cause either physical malformations where somebody is missing a uterus or something like that, or there's just other parts of the hormonal system that did not develop correctly. So, lots of different things that should be checked up on. In somebody with primary amenorrhea or in secondary amenorrhea. So, going to see a doctor for a physical
To
exam.
clarify,
Yeah,
primary is when you've never had a period in your life, and then
correct.
secondary is you had a period when you were probably a teenager, and then at some point it disappeared, right?
Yes.
So
Yep.
H is a secondary amenorrhea type, but ruling out all sorts of different conditions is really
Yes.
important. So definitely
Yes.
seeing a medical professional is important.
Yep.
And I think having the information of the book with you is a great way to advocate for yourself also, and to make sure that your medical professional is able to really do the tests that are necessary and work with you,
Yes.
not against you,
Yes.
to really rule out some of the other conditions, and maybe really state that, yes, this is really hypothalamic amenorrhea.
Yep. And couple more points to make. Another name for hypothalamic amenorrhea is hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. So the two conditions are quite similar. It's just a different name. So that can be confusing for some people. And also in primary amenorrhea, it can be because of the hypothalamus. So you can have primary hypothalamic amenorrhea if you are somebody who perhaps
Yeah.
had an eating disorder at a young age, or if you've been
Yes.
heavily involved in sport, particularly in some sports like ballet or ice skating or running, primary amenorrhea can be fairly common, and that
Yeah.
is due to the underfueling and exercise and all of those factors. And certainly, there have been many women who have recovered from primary amenorrhea, even in their 30s. If their first natural period comes when they're 31 or
And
32, and
a real puberty at 32, yeah.
yes,
But that's wonderful. I mean, that's great, that we're able to
Mhm.
reverse the effects of time and whatever, difficult situation could have caused the missing periods. Okay, so get to your doctor, get the information that you need maybe with you, advocate for yourself, and ask the questions, around how do you rule out some of those conditions. I know the book is really complete. Also about that, and we'll probably have a separate episode on HA versus PCOS, which
yes.
is a very common mistake that is made when a diagnosis is made. So I think we've gone through most of the basics.
Hmm.
Thank you so much, Nicola. That was
Absolutely.
really interesting.
Yeah.
And as usual, we like to finish the podcast with a little question for you,
Hmm.
some of our listeners, to also reflect upon. We like to ask ourselves, how have we been all in this week? So how have we been true to ourselves and honoring ourselves, and you speaking up and taking care of ourselves and feeding ourselves? Nicola, do you want to go first, or shall I start?
Sure, I'll go first. So, I have been doing this a lot in my personal life. I'm not quite ready to share some of the changes that are happening, but I'm taking some big steps and standing up for myself in ways that I have not in the past. And it's
That is
scary,
so
but
cool.
it kind of feels amazing at the same time. Um,
Course.
and then also, I truly have been working to be more all in terms of actually feeding myself. As I was just discussing, I have been not being great about that for a while because,
Yeah.
having 3 kids at home and, trying to feed them and then getting them out of the house so they're not on screens all the time, it's like I come last in that equation. And so I have been trying to be more mindful about really making sure that I am getting enough to eat as well. And, for the moment, that's been having milkshakes every night, and at
Ooh,
midnight, um,
milkshake.
and just throw some ice cream in a glass and throw some milk on top of it, mush it around with a spoon, and it's delicious. And
Right.
it's giving my body the energy that it needs. So that's yeah.
Wonderful.
How about you?
Yeah, I think feeding ourselves first, right?
Hmm.
As mothers, or not mothers, by the way, it's just kind of feeding ourselves first is really important as well. I've been all in recently on my business.
Hmm.
I found that, in the beginning of the year, with the whole pandemic and lockdown and crisis schooling, my business kind of took a hit,
Hmm.
as any businesses, right? And it was not so much about how many clients I used to see, or because I'm blessed with being virtual by design, but it was more that I found it was really difficult to kind of focus
Hmm.
on what I wanted to achieve and reaching the goals and organizing myself enough to have time for the business, as much as I invest time into taking care of my children and my husband and my home and myself, because I needed to take care of my mental health extra hard
Hmm.
in this lockdown. So I had to kind of, take less time on the business at that time because I needed to save myself. I'm someone who is naturally anxious, and so it was really difficult to be in that situation, like all of us, right? So I just kind of, now I feel like I've rethought some of my goals, and I've reorganized my days. And I don't know if we discussed this, but I still have one kid at home 100% of the time. So my kids go 50-50. So I always have one next to me. But I've organized myself with my husband so that he can take over on 2 days of the week. So Michael, if you listen
that's
to
so
us,
nice.
I love you so much. And so 2 days of the week, like, it's kind of time that I have fully to myself and to my business. So it feels really good, I have to say, to feel like I'm actually doing something, and I'm doing it in a really regular way and in a goal-oriented way. Like, I'm procrastinating a lot less, and I know where
That's
I'm
fabulous.
going. Yes, so that feels really good. So how long am I going to be able to keep up with this? Until the next lockdown, most likely. But as long as I manage, it feels really good. So my newsletter is back on, and I'm working on new projects, especially for the French speakers amongst us that we might have.
Très bien.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we should do some French speaking with you, Nicola. And so, that's how I'm all in right now. It's a little bit more kind of business focused this week, but it's been feeling really good.
That's fantastic. I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we'll see if it gives anything, results wise, but it feels good to kind of feel back on track.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
great. And, I'm being kind to myself if I can't keep it up. It's okay. We'll just be flexible. It's
That is the
it's a
word of
difficult
the year, isn't it?
yes, exactly. And not being hard on myself if I can't
Yes.
keep up. Obviously, my children are still a priority of mine. It, although I consider my business a bit of a third baby.
Yep.
Anyway, so thank you so much. I think this episode was full of nuggets of information, and I'm so appreciative of your time and efforts in always bringing us the latest science. So now it's probably time for you to go to bed, Nicola.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you, listeners, for being here and listening to us. And we will be there soon with the next episode.
Sounds great. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Maybe take a few minutes to reflect on it and how you have been all in this past week. It always strikes me how different each person's all-in journey is. As I often say, there are many paths to HA and many paths out of it. Your journey is unique.
That is so true. And if you need more support on your journey, you should definitely start with No Period Now What, which you can get at noperiod.info/book.
And Florence and I both work with people on different aspects of period recovery and so much more. So if you'd like more personal advice and attention, you can go to noperiod.info/appointments to schedule a time to speak with me on fixing the issues underlying your missing periods and figuring out what those issues are.
And I'm at beyondbodyimage.com to work with me on the deeper emotional issues and your body image. I also run a French Instagram account, Amenorrhea_FR. And obviously you can find Nicola at No Period Now What on Instagram. We also have joint clients, so you can access both our domains of expertise at the same time. If you enjoyed this podcast and found it helpful, please drop us a review to help more people find it.
Also, join the No Period Now What recovery support group at noperiod.info/support and let us know how All In is going for you.
All In is not just about period recovery, it's about getting your life back. See you in 2 weeks.
You were lost in fat love till you got lost again. You were lost in fat love. Now find yourself and then take all that you've learned about what love and loss, pleasure and pain, and never get lost again.